Welcome to our next video in our application series. This is for projects when you have land acquisition, including donated property as part of your budget request. There are key things when you're acquiring property with PARTF. Some of the questions that you ask is, what are the steps and timeline to take title of the property? What if someone donates property to our community? And what do we need to know about legal or other documentation required for the application or even after the grant is awarded? So let's take a look at a couple things. There are certain methods to acquire property. First, you have fee simple, which is an outright purchase for fair market value. The price should be based on a recent appraisal. You have a bargain sale, in which the property owner agrees to sell the land below fair market value. The amount of that difference between the selling price and the fair market value is a donation and can be used as a match. Donation is full donation, so the property owner will deed over the property. Keep in mind, in this case, it must be the donor must be a private individual or organization. It can't be like another government agency from government to government. The value of the property is established by appraisal, as in the other methods, and may be used as a match. And we'll talk a little more about that. Keep in mind a required donation. That is when land is conveyed due to a statute or rule, sometimes referenced as land dedication. This is not considered a donation as part of a match. So you can certainly take that property and develop it, but the value of that property cannot be used as a match. Keep in mind, if the facilities on these type of properties, if the local government obtains title or a long-term lease, at least 25 years of the land. So the most important thing if you're doing acquisition, do not take ownership of a property prior to the project period. And the project period is when you have a signed contract. So that's after the award's been made. A few months later, you would get a contract. It must be an executed contract before you can take ownership of the property. Eligible expenses must occur during the project period. Eligible expenses for PARTF must occur during the project period, is after the grant is awarded with the contract executed. If you take title prior to a grant award in the contract period, that means the property expense, even if it was donated and you've transferred title, that expense has occurred and the cost or value of the property is an ineligible expense. So you do not want that. That's why you do not need to take title if you're planning to do acquisition with the Park and Recreation Trust Fund. So if it's donated property, like I said, it's considered a grant expense because transfer of the title has taken place. Therefore, make sure it's not transferred prior to that project period. And if you own the property prior to the application, then you should just apply for development assistance. So as you're applying for a project that includes acquisition, the following must be included with your application: the estimated value of the property, a legal description of the land, acquisition boundary map and a concept site plan, the list of properties to be acquired. Sometimes you might have multiple parcels that are contiguous that make up a full project site or a greenway corridor. And you also need to provide a history of conveyance of any donated land. That's just when it's donated land. And what if there are improvements on the property? So capital improvements like buildings or ball fields, other structures. We've had that scenario in the past where a Little League association has transferred their ball field complex to a town, either sold it, and those ball fields are going to be used for recreation. So we want to know if they're going to be used for recreation, if there's any facilities on their old buildings or homes. Are you going to demolish it or have some other use? Those are important things to include. So when we talk about property value, the appraisal must be completed by a licensed North Carolina appraiser. This certifies that the appraisal was done using the Universal Standard of Professional Appraisal Practices. If the property is valued at over $750,000, you must have 2 appraisals submitted with the application. In those situations, the State Property Office will review both to determine the value of the property. So make sure if it's over $750,000 for the value, you need 2 appraisals. PARTF funds may only go towards property purchased at or below fair market value. So if the local government, if you're paying more than appraised value, the cost associated with PARTF will only be up to that fair market value. So remember, if your application is funded, you are responsible for paying for any cost overrun. So make sure your request is as close to the actual value as possible. And other tips to think about: what is the date of the appraisal? If you're using tax value of the property, when was the last reevaluation done? And is the seller's asking price in a reasonable range? Cost of appraisals can be considered as part of your planning. So if you want to include those prices in the planning section of your budget, you can do so and then get reimbursed at least half the cost of the appraisals. Legal description of the land. These are meets and bounds or a plat map, and you can see every year this is what that typically looks like. It's been surveyed. The map elements need to include a project title, acreage, north arrow, scale, and the date prepared. Are there easements? If so, those restrictions on public use of the property need to be included. And adjacent property uses. So who neighbors, what's the use next door to this, adjacent to this property. And any significant reference points should be included as well. Now the boundary map, that's your concept plan. So in this example you can see this would be one where they were applying for acquisition. They're looking to acquire 12 acres, but they're also doing some development with this one too. As you can see, some of the areas in green here, splash pad, retaining wall, those things are all part of this application. But even if not, I mean, this shows future development. So if you're going to put trails in the future, make sure you include all the information. And really, even if you're doing acquisition only and you're not doing any development, then your concept plan would show what's going to be there in the future. Now it's not a final plan. It doesn't say that you will have to do that, but you want to give the Park Authority an idea of the proposed park development that your community has asked for and that you've planned for. Compatibility for the location and types of recreation land that the land can support. So really this is a way to showcase what your eventual plans are for the property that you're purchasing. There's a section on the application for a list of properties for acquisition. Complete the form for each parcel proposed as part of your application. There are 4 options for payment type. Again, that will be the purchase, donated, required donation, which we talked about before, or bargain sale. And those definitions are here. The current owner, what parcel number, parcel acreage, and then the estimated value of the land. And if there's any improvements on the property, what are those values? And that's only if those improvements will be used for public park and recreation purposes or park purposes. If they're not going to be used for park purposes, do not include those value. We've had some, for example, we've had some communities that have purchased old buildings. Those were going to be removed and they were using the land for the park. So the value of those buildings had to be removed from the appraisal cost, or just not included in that appraisal cost that you would list on the value here. Other times it might be improvements, say, where it is a building that you're going to refurbish and use as a park. So then you want the value of that building or structure included. And that should be in the appraisal. And then finally list the proposed purchase price and total those up. So if it's donated, for example, you would have an estimated value and your purchase price would be 0 if it's fully donated. So again, donated land must provide a history of conveyance, copies of deeds from the past 5 years. It's very important to include that. Deed restriction. Any land purchased with PARTF funds must be dedicated for public recreation use in perpetuity. And that will require a deed restriction be placed. And PARTF, in the grant manual, if you're awarded, you will see the exact language that's needed to record on the deed, depending on if the property was purchased or donated, or if it's an easement only. There's some differences in the language. So your RRS can assist with that. And then finally, public access must be provided within 5 years of the purchase date. So we want to see, the Park Authority doesn't want to award funds just for land banking, for example. Within 5 years, we want to make sure that the public has access to this property through trails or parking, and we can work with you on that. Do you need to take title early? So see, you need to purchase property prior to having that signed contract, the executed contract that we discussed. In that case, you can request a waiver. It's called a waiver of retroactivity, and this will permit the purchase or the value, should it be donated, of property to be eligible as a PARTF expense. That means it occurred before the project period, but you have this waiver, this approval, that it can still count as a PARTF expense. Contact your regional consultant if this scenario applies. And we need to do this, as soon as you know that, make sure you don't take title. Contact the consultant. They can give you examples of what you need to submit, because the waiver must be requested in writing. The document must show the urgency to purchase this property prior to the grant award. So for example, we will lose this property. It will be sold off for development if we're not able to execute and purchase this right away. Also keep in mind that approval of a waiver does not provide any preference or guarantee that the grant will be awarded. So it's not a guarantee, but it's in place to assist. And a waiver is good for 24 months. So for 2 PARTF grant cycles, this would be available to you. Thank you. This is the conclusion of video 4 when you're applying for acquisition of land.